In today's class, Fundamental Concepts of International Politics, we studied the most fundamental concepts, namely the state and what we mean by international politics itself. Looking at 3 points, law, force, and community, we saw that while these things may exist in a coherent way within a state, they are absent from the international system itself. States do take security into their own hands, yet nonetheless, they find ways to exist peacefully and to cooperate through something we may meaningfully call international society. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Fundamental Concepts of International Politics. By fundamental, we mean basic concepts of international politics. And today we are going to learn the most basic concept of international politics. We want to learn what is international politics. And as you'll see, when we talk about international politics, we're talking about two things. We're talking about international politics as something that happens in the world, but we're also talking about international politics as a field of study. You study English, you study law, you study literature, we also study international politics. And to understand what we mean by international politics, we need to understand first what we mean by states. What we mean by states, that's the most basic part of international politics. We know what states are. Japan is a state, China is a state, Canada is a state, the United States is a state. What's another word for state?
Country.
Country, thank you very much. So by states we mean countries. We also want to talk about today international politics, and we'll see two basic ways of looking at international politics after we define it, and we'll see how each of those ways might contribute to peace. And finally, we're going to examine in some detail the differences between domestic politics and international politics. Domestic means in a country. So it's the opposite of international. All right, let's begin then. What is a state? Well, in international politics, we mean a system of government for a particular place. We can imagine Japan. We can imagine the islands of Japan. The Japanese state manages, it governs this space and only this space. It doesn't govern other places, and other states cannot govern Japan. States, therefore, have territory. They have sovereignty. Territory is space. States govern a particular place on the earth, and they have sovereignty. That means only one state can govern one place. Other states cannot interfere, cannot govern. They must respect each state's sovereignty. Having sovereignty means that the state, only the state, can make laws for that space, for the people in that place. Creates laws and then enforces them with police, for example. Only states have a military force as well, right, to protect the entire place, to defend the entire space, the entire territory. And finally, within a state, there's usually some idea of community, some idea that we are Japanese, we are Canadian, we are Brazilian. And all of the things connected to that, all the way up to the level of government and within the space. What are the unique powers that a state has that also define it? Well, one of them is the power to tax and spend. This is a recreation of an old picture from Egypt. And here we have in ancient Egypt the state of the pharaoh, the people working for the pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, and they are calculating the taxes. And here are the police for the pharaoh, and they are unfortunately punishing people who did not pay the taxes. This is one of the powers that states have. They can collect taxes from us, our money from our work, and then they can spend it. That's one of the main powers of a state. Another power of a state is one we already mentioned. Only states can have a military, right? And everybody understands that all states may have a military. All other states respect the right for states to have a military. States also control the movement of people, goods, and services. That is to say, we may not travel from Japan to another state without the permission of that other state. Sometimes we have to get permission early with a visa. Sometimes we can just go there, but we need a passport, right? This is a copy of the first passport that was issued in Meiji, Japan, the first Japanese passport from the Meiji era. And with a document like this today, we can travel, but a state gives us that document, and other states must see it if we want to enter. States also control the movement of goods, of things. These red lines show shipping routes. They show the shipping lanes, we call them, all around the world. Right? If you were wearing something from Uniqlo, for example, it probably was shipped from Southeast Asia to Japan. To leave another country and to arrive in Japan to be sold requires the permission of the states involved, the states where something is made and the states where something is delivered to be sold. And states can control that, and only states can control that. And finally, as we said, another power states have is the power of sovereignty, which means only the state can be in control, can govern where it is. Nobody else can govern the state. This is an old picture showing a king at that time, which represented the states, with all the people inside of his body. Right? Most places of the world now, we don't have kings or queens, but the idea of the state is the same. Nobody is controlling our state. Only our state controls our state. Well, now that we understand what a state is, let's ask ourselves, what is international politics? International politics is the politics of the international system. What is the international system, do you suppose? The international system is made up of states and the relationships with each other. So in international politics, we don't talk about the world very much. We talk about the international system because we're interested in the relationships between and among states. So when we talk about international politics, we are talking about and studying what happens among the world's states. What is going on among the different countries in the world? Well, there are four main things going on that we study. Trade, of course. Help. Sometimes countries help each other, right? When there's an earthquake disaster or a tsunami disaster, we often see people from around the world sent by their governments to help the people that need help, that need it. States often cooperate with each other in different ways. Unfortunately, the other side of cooperation sometimes is argument. Sometimes they argue. And more unfortunately, sometimes states have wars. And these are the things that we study when we study international politics. We study all of these things in international politics. We try to study them systematically. What that means is we don't study just one state. We don't study what one state does. We want to know what it does in relation to other states. So when we talk about Japan's economy, or we talk about Japan's foreign policy, its policy for international relations, well, we have to understand Japan's relations with different countries. Here on a map of East Asia, we would study then, well, what is Japan's trade relationship with China or with South Korea? What is Japan's political relationship with these countries? Right? Because every state exists in the international system, we study its relations with other states to try to find some systematic pattern. Now, what do you think? What do you think is the first thing we should know about international politics? And by first thing, we don't just mean first, second, third, the order. We also mean the most important thing. What do you think is the most important thing we should know about international politics? You've already gotten some information so far that might help you answer this question. What do you think is the first thing we should know about international politics? Well, let me give you a hint. The government of Japan, the Japanese state, who is above? Which government is above the Japanese government? Which government is above China's government or the government of the United States? Do you know? Well, there is no government above anybody else. There is no world government. So the first basic part of international politics is the fact of states. And the most important thing to know about the international system is there's no international government. There's no world government. There's no authority above states. Right? We are here in Haksan, which is in Bunkyoku. There's a Bunkyoku government, but it's inside of a Tokyo government, which is inside of the Japanese government. But the Japanese government is not inside any other government. It's not a part of any other government. We call this system, we call this situation anarchy. Anarchy means no government. And in the modern world today, there's really no place on earth where people live in anarchy. Really almost all territory, pretty much all territory in the world where people live is part of a state. But the international system itself has no state. The international system we call is a system of anarchy. So what is international politics then? It's politics without a government that can control or make decisions for states. There are about 200 states in the world. So there are about 200 governments, not one government. And we study, therefore, this politics in the absence of a government. We can study politics of Japan, we can study politics of India, politics of Ireland, and all of those are politics inside of a government, within a state. But here we study politics without a government. What about the United Nations? We often see the United Nations in the news. Well, the United Nations is not a government. It's a place where governments can talk and debate. And debate's good. Right? Sometimes we see in the news, right? Leaders from different countries argue or debate. That's good, right? That's better than fighting. So the United Nations is a place to do that. But the United Nations cannot make actual laws that the world governments must follow. Right? And this is because states often ignore international laws. The United Nations rules are made by states, not separate from states. Sometimes they accept these rules and sometimes they don't. And that's a result of anarchy. Well, all of that's to say there's no international 119. Right? If your government needs help, it can't call 119 for an ambulance to come or for the police to come. So states have to take care of themselves. We call it a self-help system. There's no world government, so states have to help themselves. How do they do that? Well, they worry about what we call the balance of power. The balance of power means how much power do different countries have at a particular point in time. They worry about relative power. Relative power means no matter how much power you have, if another country has more than you or less than you, you will feel stronger or you will feel weaker. And if you feel stronger or weaker, you will feel more secure or you will feel less secure. To deal with that in the self-help system, states often form alliances. They make partnerships with other states with promises to cooperate and to help each other if there's a major conflict. And they do that inside of something we call the security dilemma. The security dilemma is a word for this sort of spiral of tension that happens in an anarchic system. When one country starts to make itself stronger, another country might become nervous. So it will make itself stronger. And then both countries become tense. They feel nervous, they feel afraid. That can sometimes lead to terrible things such as war. How do we create peace then in such a system? How can we have a peaceful system? Well, one view says we have a peaceful system through superior firepower, which really just means having better weapons, having a bigger army, a bigger military. And in this view, people say, well, if a country is strong enough, nobody else will want to threaten it. And if everybody's strong, nobody will threaten anybody else. And that's how we can achieve world peace. But let's look at the international system in another way. And we can look at it in a way that we call international society. Let's find out what international society might be. First, where do you suppose it is? Where is international society? When we talk about international society, what do we imagine? I think all of you have in fact experienced international society. All of you see it in the news sometimes. I imagine some of you even participate in it on a regular basis. Where is it? Where is this international society? We talked about a world of states with no government. So where could international society be? Well, one place it exists is in international organizations. And in international politics, we call them IOs. IOs. What are international organizations? International organizations are for states. The members of international organizations are states. And they are places, an international organization is a place where states can share information and they can create rules for each other. These rules aren't the same as rules in a country, but most states usually obey most rules all of the time. If you have traveled outside Japan, you have benefited from the rules of international organizations. There are rules for airplanes flying. There are rules for passport control. All of these are the result of decisions made by states in IOs. Examples include the United Nations, the European Union, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. These are organizations where states agree to meet and share information about economics, for example, about politics in their country, and create rules for certain areas. For example, world trade often occurs through rules about trade made by the World Trade Organization. Another place where international society exists is in another kind of organization called non-governmental organizations, also known as NGOs. Maybe some of you are members of NGOs. The members of NGOs are individuals, not states. Right? It's a place just like international organizations. NGOs are a place where we can share information, but privately, person to person. We share information, we exchange ideas, and we can even exchange people through international organizations. People exchange, student exchange, for example. We can promote values and try to spread values around the world. States may not join NGOs. States are not part of an NGO, and NGOs are not controlled by states. Examples, for example, would be the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, Greenpeace, Oxfam, etc. Many, many, many more. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of NGOs around the world. And when you join an NGO or participate in an NGO, you're participating in international society. When you participate in student exchange, you're participating in international society. International society also includes trade. So if you work for an international company and you're making international business agreements, you're participating in international society. When you participate in student exchange, as I said, you're participating in international society. How do we achieve peace then in the international system? In this vision, we achieve peace in three ways, in something called the Kantian triangle. It's named after a German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, from the 19th century. And in this vision for creating peace, world peace is achieved through democracy, free trade, and international institutions. The more countries that are democratic, the more peaceful the world can be. The more countries who trade with each other, the more we can avoid conflict. We don't want to risk all of the benefits of trade. And the more we participate in international institutions, the more governments participate in IOs, the more people participate in NGOs, well, then the more likely we are to have peace. And each of these is connected to the other. And in this vision, we create peace through these three things. All right, so now we have our second way of understanding international politics, a way that offers us a path away from anarchy and toward greater cooperation. We call it international society. Let's conclude by comparing domestic politics to international politics on the 3 points that we talked about at the beginning of the class: law, force, and community. By law, we mean the laws that are made and how they are enforced. By force, we mean both the police and the military. And by community, we mean our sense of belonging and our sense of identity. So let's look at these together first. In domestic politics, in a state, the laws are clear. They are consistent. Right? They don't change very much. And they are obeyed. Right? We obey the law. Right? But what about international politics? In the international system, is the law always obeyed? Is it always clear? Can it be? In international politics, there's no world police. There's no global police. There are no real global courts that manage the daily laws around the world. Let's look at force. Let's look at military, for example. In domestic politics, citizens cannot use force. Right? If we see a crime, we may not take a stick or a gun to try and stop the crime. We are not the police. Right? In international politics, there's no global monopoly. Right? There's no world military. So what do we say about that in a country, and what do we say about this in international politics, where we don't look at people, we look at states? Finally, in a community, within a state, we have a sense of community. And this creates common loyalty, a common standard of justice, so a common idea of what is justice, as well as a common view of legitimate authority. This means what kind of power, what kind of government is okay. And we usually agree on that within a state. But outside of the states, there's no world community. Right? So there's really no loyalty to the world. There are many different communities in the world. We can't feel loyal to all of them. There are different views of something, and there are different views of what is something else. So please try to write the basic information for each of these. All right, let's check our answers together. Let's check the answers together. Well, in domestic politics, so inside of a country, we know that the law is enforced by the police and by courts. We have a standard police and courts to enforce our laws. In international politics, right, the law is inconsistent and incomplete. We have many rules, we have agreements among countries, but they're not really complete or consistent. Right? And there's no global police force. There are no global courts managing daily law around the world. On the matter of force, on the matter of military power, right? In a state, only the government. Right? Only the government can have the police, and only the government can have the military. People, citizens, the residents of the country may not have their own military, of course. In international politics, there's no global monopoly, right? There's no one military for the world. And because the world is based on sovereign states, states have their own militaries and will use those militaries when they want to. When states believe that they must use force, then they will use it when they want. Finally, let's look at community. Inside of a country, as we said, there's a common sense of loyalty, standards of justice, and view of legitimate authority. But in the international system, there's no true world community. So there's only a weak loyalty to something called the world. We are all pretty international, I think. We have probably traveled to many other countries. We like to interact with foreign exchange students, international students. But we don't really have a world identity because the world is so big. There are so many different communities and kinds of people. And we have different views of justice around the world. Even in a state, there's sometimes a different idea about justice. But around the world, there are too many different views of justice for one community to embrace all of them. And finally, we have different ideas around the world about what is legitimate. What is the best kind of government? What is the best way to have a government, to operate a government? There are different kinds of democracies, for example, so there's not even an agreement about what makes the most legitimate democracy. So hopefully we now understand the difference between international politics and domestic politics. And when we study this, we're studying something that happens outside of a government. Well, let's conclude by reviewing what we've learned today. Right? We've learned the difference between state and international politics. We learned what states are. We've understood something about the balance of power and the security dilemma. These are results of a world of anarchy. We've learned that there's also something we can call international society. So even in a system with no government, there still seems to be something like a society where we can at least cooperate and gain benefits from trading ideas and things even. We learned that these two views offer different ways to explain how we can have world peace. And finally, we learned the differences between domestic politics and international politics. Thank you very much. This is the conclusion of today's special class. I enjoyed hearing your different ideas. I enjoyed watching you work on this difficult task. And I hope that you will remember these things the next time you're watching international news and international events. This is the end of our class on international politics. I hope that, like my dog, you can now have a relaxing day. Thank you very much.